The Duchess of Blackwood did not cry when she heard the laughter. It was a sound like the shattering of fine crystal, sharp and intentionally cruel, and it found her precisely where she was most vulnerable. Standing alone near the French doors that led to the winter garden, the chill of the glass a welcome severity against her silk-gloved hand. The ballroom at Whitehall glittered, a galaxy of diamonds and ambition. But for Eleanor, it was merely a vast, gilded cage in which she was the least remarkable specimen. Her husband, Alastair, the Duke, stood a world away, near the Prince Regent, his back a rigid wall of dark blue superfine wool. He did not look at her. He had not looked at her, not once, since their carriage had deposited them at the palace gates an hour before. The laughter came from a cluster of fashionable women, their heads bowed together like predatory flowers. At their center was Lady Vivian Sterling, a woman whose beauty was a weapon she wielded with the casual precision of a master duelist. Her hair was the color of spun gold, her eyes a startling forget-me-not blue, and her favor with the Duke of Blackwood was the most poorly kept secret in London. It was Vivian's voice, a high, musical note of malice that carried across the parquet. "One must wonder at the Duchess's choice of ornament," she said, her voice just loud enough to be an accident. "Such very long gloves, almost as if she has something to conceal beneath them." A murmur of assent rippled through her acolytes. Eleanor's hand, resting on the cold glass, did not tremble. She had learned, over 6 years of a marriage that was less a union than a formal treaty, to command her body's betrayals. Her heart, however, was a less disciplined organ. It hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage of bone. She had worn the long ivory gloves to hide them, of course. The scars. They were old, silvered lines that mapped a history of pain across her forearms, a story she never told and he never asked about. They were the one part of her that felt truly private, a sealed repository of a past that belonged only to her. Another woman, emboldened by Vivian's lead, added, "My maid tells me the scars are quite dreadful. A pity for a woman in her position." "A pity for the Duke, you mean," Vivian corrected, her tone laced with a theatrical sympathy that was more insulting than outright scorn. "To be shackled to such a damaged piece. One expects a duchess to be flawless porcelain, not mended pottery." The metaphor landed. It was clever, and it was devastating. It reduced Eleanor not merely to an object, but to a broken one. She felt the eyes of those nearby slide toward her, some curious, some pitying, all confirming her status as a subject of gossip, a footnote in her own husband's life. She kept her gaze fixed on the frosted patterns on the windowpane, on the dark, skeletal shapes of the roses sleeping in the garden beyond. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She would not turn. She would not flush. She would not allow the tears that burned behind her eyes to fall. She had made a vow of endurance on her wedding day, standing beside a man whose coldness was a physical presence in the chapel. He had needed her fortune to rescue his ancient, crumbling dukedom. She had needed a title to protect her and her younger sister after their parents' death left them vulnerable to predatory relatives. It had been a transaction, stated in the clear, unsparing language of solicitors. Love was never part of the contract. But respect, she had foolishly thought, might grow in its place. She had been wrong. Her gaze drifted across the room, finding him again. Alastair was listening to something the prince was saying, a faint, polite smile on his lips. Did he hear? Did he know what was being said? Or had he, as he so often did, simply erased her from the social calculus of the evening? He saw her, she knew, as a necessary but unfortunate annex to his title. A quiet, plain woman who managed his houses with unnerving efficiency, but offered none of the glittering social currency a man of his station required. That he sought from Vivian Sterling. Eleanor drew in a slow, steadying breath, the air thick with beeswax and expensive perfume. The pain of the insult was not sharp, but deep and aching, a familiar bruise pressed upon once more. It was the public nature of it that was new. Vivian had grown bold, certain of her place, certain enough to mock the Duke's own wife in a room full of the most powerful people in England. And the Duke, by his silence, by his distance, was her accomplice. He was allowing it. In that moment, something inside Eleanor, something she had mistaken for patience, fractured. It was not a loud shattering, but a quiet, clean break. Endurance was a passive state. It was the province of martyrs and stones. She was neither. She was a woman who had survived far worse than a courtier's spite. She would not be mended pottery. She would be the kiln. Slowly, deliberately, she turned from the window. She did not look toward Vivian's circle. Instead, she allowed her eyes to sweep the room with a calm, appraising coolness she did not feel. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, a title he had given her, a role she had played with quiet perfection. Tonight, she understood it was not a role, but a weapon, and she had been letting it rust. Her gaze finally settled on her husband. He was, at that exact moment, turning his head, his eyes briefly meeting hers across the crowded floor. There was no recognition in them, no apology, no concern. It was the blank, polite glance one gives a stranger. And in that glance, a decision, cold and clear as the winter glass, formed in her mind. She would not leave him. That would be a scandal, a surrender. No, she would simply disappear. She would withdraw from his world so completely that he would one day look for her and find nothing but the echo of a woman he had never bothered to know. Later that night, in the silent, cavernous chill of their London townhouse, the decision solidified. Alistair did not come to her chambers. He never did. The vast house was divided into his sphere and hers, their paths crossing only at the breakfast table, if at all. Eleanor sat before her vanity, the gas lamps hissing softly. She pulled the long gloves from her arms, finger by finger. The motion was ritualistic, an unwrapping. There they were, the scars, a pale, silvery web against the skin of her inner arms, from wrist to elbow. They were from the fire, the one that had taken her parents and nearly taken her. They were a map of her survival. For years she had seen them as a disfigurement, a flaw to be hidden. Tonight, for the first time, she saw them as a testament. She reached up and unclasped the blackwood pearls from her ears. They were magnificent, a wedding gift from Alistair's late mother, each pearl a perfect, luminous globe. They were the emblem of her station. She had worn them tonight as an armor of respectability. Now, they felt like a collar. She laid them on the polished mahogany of the vanity, their luster seeming to dim in the low light. They belonged to the Duchess of Blackwood, the public figure. They did not belong to Eleanor. She stood and walked to the bell pull, summoning her maid, a quiet, watchful woman named Mary. When the girl arrived, her eyes wide with sleep, Eleanor's voice was calm and even. "Mary, please have my country trunks brought down. We will be leaving for Blackwood Manor in the morning." Mary blinked, surprised. "The Duke? Does he know, Your Grace?" "The Duke has his own affairs to manage," Eleanor said, the words tasting of cold iron. "And I have mine." She would go to Blackwood Manor, her dower house, a property entirely her own, deeded to her in the marriage contract. It was a place he never visited, a sprawling, neglected Jacobean relic on the far edge of the ducal lands. It was hers to command. She would take her competence, her intelligence, the very things he overlooked, and she would pour them into that crumbling estate. She would build a world for herself out of its stones and soil, a world where she was not a duchess, not a wife, not a subject of gossip, but simply the architect of her own life. She left the pearls on the vanity, a silent statement, a price returned. She did not look back. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a blur of rain-streaked carriage windows and the rhythmic clopping of hooves on muddy roads. With every mile that separated her from London, from the glittering cruelty of the court and the suffocating emptiness of her marriage, Eleanor felt a layer of artifice slough away. She had left a note for the Duke, a model of cool propriety. It stated her intention to oversee renovations at the manor, and mentioned that her stay would be of an indefinite duration. It offered no emotional explanation. It asked for nothing. It was the sort of note a business partner might leave, and she knew it was exactly how he would prefer it. Blackwood Manor, when she finally saw it, was even more dilapidated than she had remembered from her one brief visit after the wedding. It stood on a slight rise, its dark stone streaked with damp, its mullioned windows like hollow eyes. A pair of ancient oaks, twisted and bare, stood sentinel before it. The county locals, she recalled, called it the Grey House. It looked the part. Yet, as the carriage crunched to a halt on the weedy gravel drive, Eleanor felt not despair, but a profound and thrilling sense of purpose. This was hers. This ruin, this neglect, this forgotten corner of the world. It was a challenge she could meet. She was met at the door by Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose spine was as rigid as her tightly pinned gray bun. Her expression was one of ingrained skepticism, the look of a servant who had seen too many masters come and go with grand plans that dissolved at the first sign of inconvenience. "Your Grace," she said, her curtsy shallow, her eyes taking in Eleanor's simple traveling dress and unadorned state. "We were not expecting you." "I am aware, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor replied, stepping over the threshold into a grand hall that smelled of dust and damp stone. "That is the first thing I intend to change." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor did not change things so much as resurrect them. She began with the heart of the house, the accounts. The estate ledgers, bound in cracked and peeling leather, were a chaotic mess of spidery script and haphazard figures. For 3 days, she did not leave the library, a vast, cold room where the only warmth came from a grudging fire. With Mary bringing her trays of tea and toast, she worked, her mind finding a familiar, calming rhythm in the logic of numbers. She traced the estate's income and expenditures, the rents from the tenant farms, the meager profits from the timber sales, the endless drain of repairs that were clearly never made. She discovered a pattern of mismanagement that was less about corruption and more about simple, profound neglect. By the second week, She was no longer confined to the library. Dressed in a practical woolen gown and sturdy boots, she began to walk the estate. She visited the tenant farms, her arrival causing a stir of consternation and surprise. The tenants, accustomed to dealing with a succession of indifferent stewards, were wary of the sudden appearance of the Duchess. But Eleanor did not arrive with pronouncements and demands. She arrived with questions. She asked about the soil, the leaking roofs, the ailing livestock. She listened, her face serious and attentive, to their litany of complaints. She walked the waterlogged fields with a farmer named Hobbs, her hem dragging in the mud, as he explained the problem with the drainage ditches that had been clogged for a decade. She inspected the rotting timbers of a barn, the failing slate on a cottage roof. She was not playing the lady of the manor. She was conducting a survey, a diagnosis of a sickness that ran deep in the land. Mrs. Gable watched her with a hawk's eye. The housekeeper had expected airs, demands, and a swift retreat to the comforts of London. Instead, she saw a woman who rose at dawn, who spent her days in consultation with the estate steward, Mr. Davies, a decent, overwhelmed man, and her evenings poring over maps and ledgers. She saw a duchess who was not afraid of mud on her boots or the smell of a cow byre. One evening, Mrs. Gable entered the library to find Eleanor asleep in her chair, her head pillowed on a massive book of crop rotation schedules, an ink smudge on her cheek. A flicker of something akin to respect ignited in the old woman's chest. "Your Grace," she said, her voice softer than usual, "you will wear yourself to a bone." Eleanor started, blinking away sleep. "There is so much to be done, Mrs. Gable. We are losing money where we should be making it. The tenants are living in conditions that are, frankly, shameful. The Dukes of Blackwood have not concerned themselves with Blackwood Manor for 50 years, the housekeeper stated, a simple fact. "Then it is time," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm, "that the Duchess of Blackwood did." This became her mantra. She hired a team of local men to clear the drainage ditches. She contracted with a slater from the nearby village to begin repairing the tenants' roofs, starting with the most dire. She sold off a stand of mature but rotting timber and used the funds to buy new livestock. She restructured the rent agreements, offering reductions to tenants who agreed to implement new, more efficient farming techniques she had researched. Mr. Davies, the steward, who had at first been deeply suspicious of her interference, quickly became her most ardent convert. He had never worked with anyone who possessed such a formidable grasp of detail, nor such a quiet, unyielding determination. The house, too, began to breathe again. Under Eleanor's direction, windows were unshuttered, rooms were aired, and the scent of beeswax and lemon oil began to replace the smell of decay. She did not focus on the grand reception rooms, but on making the kitchens functional, the servants' quarters warm, and the library a comfortable, organized space for her work. She was not restoring a showpiece. She was building a home, a life. And in the quiet, purposeful rhythm of her days, the memory of the London ballroom, of Vivian's cruel laughter, and Alistair's indifferent gaze began to fade. It was not gone, but it was no longer the central feature of her emotional landscape. It was a distant storm, its thunder now too far away to shake the foundations of the world she was building. The locals, who had first whispered about the strange, solitary Duchess at the Grey House, began to speak of her with a kind of grudging admiration. They saw the tangible results of her presence, the mended roofs, the drier fields, the prompt payment from the estate office.
They called her the Grey Duchess, a name born of the house she inhabited, but it took on a new meaning. It spoke of her quiet, unassuming presence, her lack of ostentation, her focus on substance over style. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt seen. Not as a title, not as a fortune, not as a damaged piece of pottery, but as herself. And it was a feeling more valuable than all the diamonds in London. She had come to Blackwood Manor to disappear, but instead, she was finally, truly, beginning to exist. In London, the absence of the Duchess of Blackwood was, at first, barely a ripple.
Alistair read her note with a flicker of annoyance, followed by a sense of vague relief. Her quiet, reproachful presence was a constant, low-grade irritant in his life. Her retreat to the country was, on the surface, a convenience. It freed him to spend his evenings with Vivian, unburdened by the pretense of a shared home. Vivian, for her part, was triumphant. She saw Eleanor's departure as a surrender, a clear sign that she had won. She became more proprietary, more demanding of Alistair's time, assuming the role of unofficial duchess at his dinner parties, her laughter echoing in the halls of the townhouse where Eleanor's silence had once reigned. But the silence she left behind was of a different quality. It was not the quiet of a mouse in the walls. It was the profound stillness of a vacated throne. Alistair began to notice it in small, unsettling ways. The household, which had run with the silent, flawless precision of a fine watch under Eleanor's supervision, began to show signs of friction. A footman was insolent. The menus became repetitive. A bill from a wine merchant was paid twice. These were minor things, but they were cracks in the perfect facade of his life, a facade he had not realized Eleanor was solely responsible for maintaining. Then came the first report from Mr. Davies. Alistair had expected a litany of expenses, requests for funds to support his wife's rustic whims. He opened the envelope with a sigh of resignation, prepared to be irritated. Instead, he found a meticulously detailed accounting of the quarter's profits. The figures were not monumental, but they were black, not red. Davies reported the sale of the blighted timber, the projected increase in crop yields from the newly drained fields, the revised rent schedules that had improved both tenant morale and the estate's income stream. The report concluded with a line that snagged in Alistair's mind. Her Grace's acumen in these matters is formidable. She has accomplished in 3 months what has been neglected for 30 years. He stared at the letter, a strange feeling prickling at him. It was not pride. It was confusion. The woman described in this letter, a pragmatic, intelligent, formidable manager, bore no resemblance to the pale, silent wife he knew. He had always thought of her as decorative but breakable, a woman defined by a quiet fragility. He had married her for her father's fortune, a fortune built by a man renowned for his shrewdness in trade. It had simply never occurred to him that the daughter might have inherited the father's mind. He saw Vivian that evening. She was radiant in emerald silk, chattering about a new shipment of French lace and the latest scandal involving a minor baron. For the first time, Alistair found his attention wandering. Her conversation, which had once seemed so witty and sparkling, now struck him as trivial. It was a confection of gossip and materialism, and it suddenly felt profoundly insubstantial. He found himself thinking of the phrase in Davies's letter, formidable acumen. He tried to picture Eleanor, his Eleanor,
demonstrating acumen of any kind, and found that he could not. The image refused to form. A month later, a second report arrived, this one detailing a plan Eleanor had devised to build a small mill on the river that bordered the estate, a project that would not only serve their tenants, but generate significant income from the surrounding farms. It was ambitious, well-researched, and financially sound. Alistair read it twice, a frown deepening between his brows. This was not a whim. This was a strategy. He felt a stab of something he could only identify as shame. He, the Duke of Blackwood, had allowed a significant portion of his ancestral lands to rot through sheer indifference, while his wife, the woman he treated as little more than a household fixture, was single-handedly reviving it. The rumors began to reach him from his country neighbors.
Letters from acquaintances in the county mentioned the astonishing transformation at Blackwood Manor. They spoke of the Duchess not with pity, but with a kind of baffled respect. The Grey Duchess, they called her, a woman who knew more about crop rotation than court gossip, and who could negotiate the price of slate with the sharpness of a fishwife. The name, which had been born in mockery, was now a title of honour. Vivian heard the rumours too, and they displeased her. "It is unseemly," she declared one afternoon as she and Alistair rode in the park. "A duchess grubbing in the dirt with farmers. She makes you a laughing-stock. People will think you cannot control your own wife." "The estate is turning a profit for the first time in my lifetime," Alistair said, his voice clipped. "I find that difficult to laugh at." Vivian shot him a sharp look, sensing the shift in his tone. "Darling, you are a duke. You do not need to concern yourself with the sordid business of profit and loss. That is what stewards are for. Her playing at being a farmer is an embarrassment." She saw Eleanor's industry not as a virtue, but as a threat, a competing source of value he might come to recognize. Her power over him was rooted in his belief that she was the only source of vitality and brilliance in his life. Eleanor's quiet competence was a direct challenge to that monopoly. That evening, alone in his study, Alistair found himself walking to the mantelpiece. Propped there was a small, exquisite miniature of Vivian, painted on ivory. Beside it, from a time he barely remembered, was a wedding miniature of Eleanor. He picked it up. The artist had captured her quiet solemnity, the steady intelligence in her dark eyes, an intelligence he now realized he had never once engaged. He had seen her only as a symbol of the financial compromise he'd been forced to make. He had looked at her, but he had never, ever seen her. He thought of the night of the ball, of Vivian's cruel, glittering circle. He had heard the remark about the gloves. He had heard the term mended pottery. He had heard it, and he had done nothing. At the time, it had seemed beneath him to engage in what he considered feminine squabbles. He had told himself his indifference was a sign of his station, his removal from such petty concerns. Now, for the first time, he saw it for what it was, a profound and unforgivable failure of duty. She was his wife, his Duchess, and he had stood by, a silent accomplice, while she was publicly flayed. A cold knot of self-disgust tightened in his gut. He had organized his life around principles of honor and duty, yet in the most fundamental duty a man has to his wife, the duty of protection, he had failed utterly. He had mistaken his pride for principle, his emotional cowardice for aristocratic detachment. He placed Eleanor's miniature back on the mantel, his fingers tracing the cool, smooth surface. He made a decision. He would go to Blackwood Manor. He would see for himself what she had built. He did not know what he would say to her, or what he could possibly do to mend the chasm between them. He only knew that he could no longer abide the ghost that haunted his house, the ghost of a woman who was more alive, it seemed, 100 miles away than she had ever been under his own roof. Alistair's arrival at Blackwood Manor was unannounced. He rode the final miles alone, having left his carriage and groom at the posting inn in the village. He wanted to see the estate as a traveller would, not as its master. What he saw startled him. The fields, which he remembered as marshy and unproductive, were now delineated by neat, clear-running ditches. Fences were mended. The roofs of the tenant cottages, once patched with tar and hope, now sported fresh, grey slate that gleamed in the weak afternoon sun. There was an air of industry, of quiet prosperity, that felt utterly alien to his memory of the place. He rode up the drive to the manor itself and paused, taking in the house. The stone was still dark, the architecture severe, but it no longer looked like a tomb. The windows were clean, curtains hung within, and a thin plume of smoke rose from a half-dozen chimneys, a sign of life and warmth. He dismounted, tied his horse to the old iron ring by the door, and knocked. The door was opened not by a footman, but by Mrs. Gable, who looked at him as if he were a debt collector. Her eyes, small and sharp, took in his riding clothes, the fine quality of his boots, and the ducal signet ring on his finger. "Your Grace," she said, the title sounding more like an accusation than a welcome. She did not curtsy. "I have come to see the Duchess," he said, his voice sounding hollow in the stone entryway. "Her Grace is occupied," Mrs. Gable stated flatly, making no move to let him in. Alistair felt a surge of his old, familiar arrogance. He was the master of this house, and this servant was barring his entry. But the look in her eyes, a fiercely protective, almost proprietary glare, gave him pause. This woman was loyal not to the title, but to the woman. "Nevertheless," he said, his tone softening slightly, "I will wait." With a reluctant sigh, she finally stepped aside, leading him not to a grand drawing room, but to the library. The room was transformed. The dusty, funereal chamber he vaguely remembered was now a bright, functional workspace. Books were neatly shelved, maps were laid out on a large central table, and the air smelled of wood smoke and paper. And there, at a desk near the window, sat Eleanor. She was not dressed as a duchess. She wore a simple gown of dark gray wool, her hair pinned back in a severe but practical knot. Her head was bent over a ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not look up as he entered. She was so absorbed in her work that she was entirely unaware of his presence. He stood there for a long moment, simply watching her. He saw the faint ink smudge on her finger, the focused intensity of her profile, the quiet competence that radiated from her like a low heat. This was the woman from the steward's letters, the Grey Duchess. "Eleanor," he said. Her head snapped up, her eyes widened, first in shock, then in a kind of cool, guarded appraisal. There was no welcome in her expression, no pleasure, only a profound, unsettling stillness. She looked at him as if he were a stranger who had wandered into her private chambers. "Alistair," she replied, her voice even. "This is an unexpected visit." She did not rise. She did not smile. She simply waited. The cool reception unnerved him. He was accustomed to being the center of any room he entered, the focus of its attention. Here, in this room she had claimed, he was an interruption. "I received Davy's reports," he began, feeling strangely clumsy. "The work you have done here,
"It is remarkable. I have been addressing years of neglect," she said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, which was somehow worse. "The estate required it." "I came to see for myself." He gestured vaguely around the room at the evidence of her labor. "I confess, I did not realize." He trailed off, unsure how to finish. "I did not realize you were capable. I did not realize you had a mind. I did not realize I had married a stranger." A faint, ironic smile touched her lips. It was a humor so dry it was almost invisible. "Few people do," she said. "It has been one of my greatest assets." The conversation stalled. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. 6 years of distance, a public humiliation, a quiet abandonment. He felt the overwhelming urge to fill the silence, to explain, to justify himself. But looking at her calm, self-possessed face, he knew that his usual methods, aristocratic pronouncements, a cool withdrawal, would be useless here. She was not the same woman he had last seen across a crowded ballroom.
That woman had been defined by his perception of her. This woman was defined by herself. "The tenants seem to hold you in high regard," he tried again, feeling like a fool. "I listen to their concerns, and I pay my bills on time," she said. "It is a surprisingly effective strategy for earning goodwill." The subtle barb hit its mark. He was the one who had let rents go uncollected and bills fall into arrears through his grand indifference. He walked over to the large table, pretending to study a map of the estate's drainage system. He could feel her eyes on him, watchful and unreadable. "This mill you are planning," he said, seizing on a neutral topic. "It is an ambitious undertaking." "It is a necessary one," she corrected him. "The estate must be self-sufficient. It cannot rely on outside infusions of capital." The reference to her own dowry, the money that had saved his dukedom, was unmistakable. It was a wound he had inflicted on their marriage from its very first day, branding it a transaction. He had thought her too gentle, too naive to resent it. He saw now that he had mistaken dignity for ignorance. "Eleanor," he said, turning to face her fully, "about London. The ball." Her expression shuttered instantly. The cool neutrality was replaced by a look of sheer, cold refusal. "There is nothing to say about London," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I have found my work here more than occupies my time." It was a dismissal, polite and absolute. She was drawing a boundary, and he knew with a sickening certainty that he was on the wrong side of it. He had come here expecting… what? That she would be grateful for his attention? That a few words of praise would mend the chasm he had spent years digging? A crisis arrived not in the form of fire or flood, but on a sheet of crisp, cream-colored paper bearing a London postmark. It was a letter from Alistair's solicitor, and it arrived 3 days into the Duke's tense, awkward stay at Blackwood Manor. He read it in the library, in the very chair Eleanor now favored, and the blood drained from his face. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a fear he had not felt since he was a young man inheriting a title on the brink of ruin. Eleanor, entering the room with a fresh set of architectural drawings for the mill, saw his expression and paused. He was holding the letter in a hand that trembled slightly, his face a mask of pale shock. In that moment, he did not look like the powerful, untouchable Duke of Blackwood. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice. "What is it?" she asked, her voice losing its guarded edge, replaced by a flicker of genuine concern. He looked up at her, his eyes unfocused.
For a moment, he seemed to see right through her. Then, with a visible effort, he composed himself, the ducal mask sliding back into place. "It is a business matter," he said stiffly. "It does not concern you." The familiar dismissal, the automatic exclusion from his world, should have stung. Instead, Eleanor felt a flash of impatience. "Alistair," she said, her tone sharp, "I have spent the last 6 months untangling the finances of this estate. I'm quite certain that whatever business matter can make you look as if you've seen a ghost most certainly does concern me. Or at least, it concerns the solvency of the title I hold." Her directness seemed to break through his pride. He hesitated, then passed the letter to her across the table. His hand was still not entirely steady. "Vivian," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Her debts." Eleanor took the letter. It was a formal demand for payment from a syndicate of moneylenders. Lady Vivian Sterling had, it seemed, been living far beyond even her generous means, using her known association with the Duke of Blackwood as collateral. She had accumulated a staggering amount of debt, signing his name to promissory notes, assuring her creditors that the Duke would stand by her.
Now, with her own resources exhausted, the creditors were coming to collect from him. The sum was enormous, enough to jeopardize the fragile financial stability the dukedom had only recently regained. To refuse to pay would create a scandal of epic proportions, linking his name to fraud and ruin. To pay would cripple them. Eleanor read the letter through twice, her expression unreadable. The silence in the room stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Alistair watched her, bracing himself for her reaction. He expected anger, recrimination, a bitter "I told you so." He deserved it. He had allowed his affair with Vivian to become a public spectacle, had flaunted it while ignoring his own wife, and now his folly was threatening to bring down everything his ancestors had built, everything her fortune had saved. But Eleanor was not angry. When she finally looked up from the letter, her face was calm, her eyes narrowed in thought. She was not looking at him as a betrayed wife. She was looking at the letter as a problem to be solved. "These promissory notes," she said, her voice all business. "Did you sign them?" "No, of course not," he said, affronted. "It's forgery." "Can you prove it? Are the signatures demonstrably different from your own?" I don't know. Perhaps. But to claim forgery would mean a public trial. Vivian would be ruined. My name, our name, would be dragged through the very worst kind of scandal. The honor he had prized so highly was now a trap. Eleanor tapped a finger on the letter. "Scandal is temporary. Ruin is permanent." She walked over to a tall cabinet and retrieved a file. "Here are the estate account books from London. I had Davies send them. I need to see your signature." For the next hour, they worked. They sat at the great table, their heads bent together over the ledgers, a proximity that would have been unthinkable a week ago. Eleanor compared the signatures on the household accounts with the descriptions of the notes in the solicitor's letter. Her focus was absolute. She was quick, analytical, her mind moving with a speed and clarity that left Alistair feeling slow and clumsy. He found himself answering her questions, deferring to her judgment, following her lead. He was no longer the Duke of Blackwood, and she his quiet consort. They were two strategists facing a common enemy. "The signatures are clever forgeries," she concluded finally, pushing the books away. "But they are forgeries. A good expert could prove it. However, you are right. A public trial would be a disaster." She looked at him, her gaze direct and searching. "Tell me about the fire." The question came out of nowhere, so completely disconnected from the matter at hand that it took Alistair a full 10 seconds to comprehend it. "The fire?" he repeated, bewildered. "The fire at my family's home," she clarified, her voice quiet but insistent. "The one that killed my parents. The one you pulled me from." He recoiled as if she had struck him. It was the great, unspoken thing between them, the single, violent event that had preceded their sterile marriage. They had never spoken of it, not once in 6 years. "What has that got to do with this?" he demanded, his voice harsh with a pain he thought long buried. "Everything," she said softly. Her eyes dropped to her own hands, which were resting on the table. She slowly, deliberately, began to unbutton the cuff of her sleeve. "You have never asked me about these," she said, rolling the sleeve up to her elbow. The scars were stark in the firelight, a delicate, terrifying lacework of silvered skin. "You have never acknowledged them. You have never acknowledged that night at all." He couldn't breathe. He remembered that night with a clarity that felt like a physical illness. The smell of smoke, the heat, the screams. He had been a guest at her father's house, discussing the final details of the marriage contract. He remembered finding her in her smoke-filled room, a falling, burning beam pinning her arm to the floor. He remembered the sickening sound it made as he'd heaved it off her, the feel of her unconscious form in his arms as he carried her out through the collapsing hall. "I pulled you from the fire," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "That is all." "No," she said, looking up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of a long-held, terrible grief. "That is not all. You were injured too. Your back. The beam grazed you as it fell. You were burned." He flinched, his hand instinctively going to his back, hidden beneath his coat and waistcoat. No one knew. He had dismissed the injury as minor, had his own physician treat it privately, had borne the pain and the subsequent scarring in silence. He had seen it as a sign of weakness, an unseemly vulnerability. It was his secret shame, just as he had assumed her scars were hers. "I saw it," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "That night, when the doctor was treating you, I was in the next room. I saw the burns on your back. And then, you never spoke of it. You never spoke of any of it. You treated me with such coldness, such distance. I thought—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I thought you blamed me, that you were disgusted by my scars, that I was a constant, ugly reminder of a trauma you wished to forget." The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so devastating. He had been silent out of his own shame, his own prideful refusal to admit to injury or trauma. He had constructed a wall of cold principle around himself to hide his vulnerability. And she, on the other side of that wall, had interpreted his silence as revulsion, his distance as blame. He had not been protecting himself. He had been crucifying her. For 6 years, she had lived with the belief that the man who had saved her life was disgusted by the very marks of her survival. "No," he choked out, the word tearing from his throat. "Eleanor, no. It was not disgust. It was guilt." She stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "Guilt? For what? You saved me." "I was too slow,"
he said, the confession raw and agonizing. The beam. If I had been a moment faster, it would not have struck you. The scars. They are my failure. Every time I saw you, I saw them. And I saw my own failure to protect you. My silence. My distance. It was not aimed at you. It was at myself. The dam of 6 years of silence, of misunderstanding and profound, lonely pain, finally broke. The library, which had been a place of work, of strategy, became a confessional. The financial crisis precipitated by his mistress was forgotten, eclipsed by a far greater, more ruinous debt he had not even known he owed. He had organized his entire emotional life around a wound, calling it principle. He had seen her scars not as a testament to her strength, but as a reproach to his weakness. And in his pride, he had left her utterly alone with her pain, never realizing he was leaving himself alone with his. "Oh, Alistair," she whispered. And for the first time in their marriage, she reached across the space that separated them and laid her scarred hand over his. The contact was electric, a bridge across a chasm of silence. The true crisis was not the letter from London. It had been living in their house, in their lives, all along. And now, finally, it had a name. The resolution to the matter of Lady Vivian's debts was both swift and brutal, and it took place not in a courtroom, but in the drawing room of a powerful society matriarch, Lady Danbury. Eleanor, armed with the truth of Alistair's own story and a newfound sense of partnership, had devised the strategy. A public trial was indeed too messy, too damaging. But a private one, conducted under the unforgiving gaze of the very society Vivian sought to rule, would be far more effective. Alistair, humbled and ready to follow her lead for the first time, agreed without hesitation. He requested a meeting with the principal creditors, along with Lady Danbury, whose word was law in the ton. And, crucially, Vivian's own father, a bluff country earl who believed his daughter to be a paragon of virtue. They gathered in Lady Danbury's formidable London drawing room, the air thick with tension and the scent of old money. Vivian was there, looking pale but defiant, confident that Alistair would, in the end, pay to avoid a scandal. She believed she still held that power over him. Alistair, with Eleanor standing quietly at his side, laid out the facts. He presented the promissory notes. He admitted his connection to Lady Vivian, a fact that caused her father's face to purple with rage. But then, he flatly, calmly, stated that the signatures were forgeries and that he would not be paying the debts. The creditors erupted. Vivian's father spluttered. Vivian herself gave a small, theatrical cry of outrage. "He is lying!" she exclaimed, turning her tear-filled eyes to Lady Danbury. "He promised me. He loves me. He is only doing this because she pointed a trembling finger at Eleanor, has poisoned him against me with her country manners and her dreary face. She is a jealous, scarred creature, and she has bewitched him." It was a fatal miscalculation. The attack, so personal and so vicious, stripped away any pretense of victimhood. Lady Danbury's expression hardened into granite. Vivian's father looked at his daughter with dawning horror. But it was Alistair's reaction that sealed her fate. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Vivian. He looked at Eleanor, a long, steady look of profound, public solidarity. Then he turned to the assembled group. "Lady Vivian speaks of my wife's scars," he said, his voice low and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "She presents them as a flaw, a mark of damage.
He paused, and then he did something that made every person in the room gasp. Slowly, deliberately, he began to remove his coat. He folded it neatly and laid it over a chair. Then he began to unbutton his waistcoat. The room was utterly still. The only sound the soft pop of buttons. He turned his back to them and shrugged off his shirt, letting it fall to the floor. The gasps turned to murmurs of shock. His back, from the right shoulder down to his waist, was a tapestry of old burns. The skin was puckered and ridged, a stark, angry landscape of scar tissue that was far more severe than anything on Eleanor's arms. "These," Alistair said, his voice resonating with a quiet power, "are my scars. I received them on the same night the Duchess received hers, in the fire that took her parents. I was pulling her from beneath a burning beam that had fallen upon her. My scars are hidden by my clothes. Hers are not. That is the only difference." He turned back to face them, his expression one of cold, righteous fury. "My wife's scars are not a mark of damage. They are the emblem of her survival. They are a testament to a courage I have spent 6 years failing to acknowledge. These debts," he said, gesturing to the papers on the table, "are the product of a foolish and dishonorable chapter of my life. I will not pay them, but I will see that my name is cleared. If you wish to pursue a case of forgery against Lady Vivian, you may. I will provide my full cooperation." The effect was devastating. Vivian Sterling's entire persona was built on the currency of beauty, charm, and social standing. In a single, dramatic gesture, Alistair had recast her as a common forger and a malicious gossip, while elevating his quiet, overlooked wife to the status of a heroine. He had not just defended Eleanor, he had claimed her story, and his part in it, as a source of honor. Vivian's father, utterly humiliated, stammered that he would, of course, cover his daughter's debts to avoid a trial. Lady Danbury gave a sharp, decisive nod. Her judgment passed. The social execution was complete. Vivian did not scream or faint. She simply seemed to collapse in on herself, her beauty suddenly looking brittle and cheap. She was ruined, not by a court of law, but by a court of her peers, undone by the very weapon of public opinion she had so expertly wielded against others. Later that evening, in the carriage back to the townhouse, the silence was not cold and empty, but full and resonant. Eleanor sat beside Alistair, not touching, but aware of his presence in a way she had never been before. He had taken his shirt and coat from a footman and dressed before they left Lady Danbury's, but the image of his scarred back was seared into her mind. It was a mirror to her own, a shared history made visible. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the passing gas lamps. The ducal mask was gone. In its place was a man stripped bare, his expression vulnerable and uncertain. "It is I who should be thanking you, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and begging your forgiveness. For 6 years of unforgivable pride, for a blindness so profound I almost lost everything." He did not say, "I almost lost you." He did not have to. The words hung in the air between them, more powerful for being unspoken. When they reached the townhouse, the house that had been a cold tomb for their marriage, he did not turn toward his own wing. He walked with her to the base of the grand staircase. There he stopped and reached into his waistcoat pocket. He drew out a small, velvet-wrapped object. "I found these on your vanity after you left," he said, his voice low. He unwrapped it. Lying in his palm were the blackwood pearls. They gleamed with a soft, warm light. "I kept them. I told myself it was because they belonged to the estate, but that was a lie. I kept them because they were the last piece of you I had."
He held them out to her. It was not a command. It was a question, an offering. Eleanor looked from the pearls to his face. She saw the guilt, the hope, the profound, terrifying honesty in his eyes. She thought of the woman who had left them behind, a woman fleeing humiliation, seeking refuge in solitude. She was not that woman anymore. She had built a world for herself, found her own strength. She no longer needed to hide or to run. She could choose. Slowly, she reached out her hand. But she did not take the pearls. Instead, she curled her fingers around his, her scarred skin pressing against his. "Let's go home, Alistair," she said softly. "To Blackwood." He looked down at their joined hands, at the map of their shared past now held between them. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek, landing on her wrist. "Yes," he whispered. "Let's go home." 3 years later, the gardens at Blackwood Manor were a riot of late summer color. The roses, which had once been skeletal shapes against a winter window pane, now climbed the mellow stone walls in a profusion of crimson and white. The air was warm, smelling of cut grass and damp earth. The gray house was gray no longer. It was alive, the heart of a thriving, prosperous estate. Eleanor sat on a stone bench, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She was not wearing gloves. The silvered scars on her arms were visible in the dappled sunlight, as much a part of her as the color of her eyes. She wore a simple blue dress, and at her ears, a pair of luminous pearl earrings gleamed. They no longer felt like a collar or a symbol of a role she was forced to play. They felt like a gift, freely given and freely accepted. A shout of laughter drew her attention. Across the lawn, Alistair was chasing their son, a 2-year-old boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's serious, intelligent eyes. The boy, James, shrieked with delight as Alistair caught him, swinging him high into the air.
Alistair's face, once a mask of cold pride, was transformed by laughter. He looked younger, freer, a man unburdened. He caught her eye across the lawn and smiled. A genuine, uncomplicated smile that still, after 3 years, had the power to make her heart ache with a quiet, profound joy. Their life together at Blackwood was not one of grand, dramatic passion. It was built of smaller, sturdier things. Shared breakfasts in the sunny morning room, long evenings in the library debating plans for the estate, the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other without the need for constant words. He had learned to listen, and she had learned to trust. The work of rebuilding had been slow, patient, and mutual. He set James down, and the boy immediately made a wobbly beeline for his mother, a fistful of daisies clutched in his hand. He stumbled the last few feet, tumbling into Eleanor's skirts. She laughed, scooping him into her lap. "For Mama," James said, thrusting the crushed flowers at her. "Thank you, my darling," she said, kissing his soft cheek. Alistair walked over, his shadow falling over them. He sat on the bench beside her, his arm resting lightly along the back, his fingers just brushing her shoulder. It was a simple, familiar gesture of possession and affection. "Mr. Davies was right," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Your acumen is indeed formidable. The new accounts for the mill came in this morning. The profits are remarkable." Eleanor smiled, leaning her head back against his arm. "I had a good partner," she said. He looked at her, his expression softening. "No," he said quietly. "I had a good teacher." He had become her partner in all things, not just in business, but in life. He knew the names of the tenants, the concerns of the village, the stories written in the land. He had learned the language of her world, the world she had built from the ruins of their neglect. And in learning it, he had found his own way home. The shame of his past with Vivian Sterling had faded, replaced by the solid reality of the life he now lived. Vivian herself had disappeared from society, retreating with her father to the country in disgrace, a half-forgotten ghost of a season long past. Her power had been an illusion, a thing of smoke and mirrors, and it had vanished in the face of a simple, solid truth. Later that evening, after James was asleep, they stood by the window in the library, looking out at the moonlit gardens. A fire crackled in the hearth, the same hearth where she had once slept, exhausted, on a book of crop rotations. The room was their sanctuary, the heart of their shared world. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "London, the balls, the court." Eleanor considered the question. She thought of the glittering room, the cruel laughter, the feeling of being invisible in a crowd of hundreds. She thought of the woman she had been, the Duchess of Blackwood, a quiet ghost haunting the edges of her own life. "I miss nothing," she said, and it was the simple, unvarnished truth. She turned from the window to face him. "Everything I have ever wanted is here." Alistair reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of a scar on her forearm. His touch was no longer hesitant or tinged with guilt. It was reverent, familiar. "I was a fool, Eleanor," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "A blind, proud fool." "We were strangers," she corrected him softly, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "And now we are not." It was, she thought, the most accurate summary of their story. Not a romance of love at first sight, but a quieter, more difficult story of love at last sight. A love earned through the painful, necessary work of seeing another person for who they truly are. He drew her closer, and in the warm, fire-lit quiet of the house they had rebuilt together, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding peace. The settling of a long-held debt, the final quiet triumph of a love that had found its way out of the ruin.